Hi guys, this is just a quick little determining the equation given a trig graph video. I just screenshotted these questions from your notes, so these three multiple choice questions are from lesson 10-4 if you want to follow along. This first question, if we just look at the graph given, this looks like our regular sine curve, and I could easily find an equation here once I figure out the amplitude is 1. And remember, my frequency is how many cycles do I have from 0 to 2 pi. So in this case, I have one complete cycle once I get to 2 pi. So if I needed to write an equation for this, I could write y equals, my amplitude is 1, sine of my frequency is 1, x. I don't have any shifts left, right, up, or down. But if you look at my answer choices, none of them are sine equations, so I know I'm going to have to change this to be a cosine graph. I could extend my graph downwards and create a cosine curve that looks like this. Since I'm starting at a minimum value, that would have to be a negative cosine function. And if you look at all of my answer choices, all of them are positive cosine curves. And I know that positive cosine curves always start at a maximum. So I know that my curve is going to start up here and finish over here. Now I have a cosine curve. And if I think about what a cosine curve looks like in general, it always starts at a maximum, finishes at a maximum, and it always starts at x equals 0. In this case, we're starting at x equals pi over 2. So to get from 0 to pi over 2, I moved over to the right. So I want to look for an answer choice that just has a cosine curve, move to the right pi over 2, which would be choice 2. If I look down here at the second question, just by first glance, this looks like a sine curve, right? If I follow this pattern, that's typically what a sine curve looks like. I know that I could also write an equation of a cosine curve if I started here and ended there. So if I wanted to write it as a cosine curve, then I would just have to shift this all. I would just have to shift everything over. So I start at whatever this maximum value is, which in this case looks to be like it's moved to the right pi. But remember to always use your answer choices to help you. So if I look at the answer choices for this particular question, all of them are sine curves. So we can go back to figuring out that this is going to follow this pattern, right? And this is where it's important to find your midline first, because once I determine the midline, which is here at y equals 1, that helps me get the amplitude. And I need the amplitude in order to write the equation. That's why it's important to find the midline. I know that sine always starts at the midline. So using my answer choices, I know that I'm doing a sine function, and I know that the midline is going to be here because sine always starts at the midline. So my amplitude is equal to 1. The other things I need for writing an equation is the frequency, which is how many cycles I have from 0 to 2 pi. In this case, that is 1/2 of a cycle. Since it's starting at x equals 0, I'm not shifting left or right, but we did move up 1, so I know that my equation is going to have a plus 1 at the end, as you can see from all of these answer choices. So we said the amplitude is 1, and the frequency is 1/2. All right, and down here, at first glance, it looks like we have a sine curve, right? Sine curve here. I know that I could potentially write this as a cosine function, like this. And I would just have to shift my cosine curve over, in this case, pi over 4. So I think it's just getting used to when we look at these functions. Of course, we see a sine curve, but depending on our answer choices, this could be a cosine curve shifted over. So now that we know it's a sine curve, I know that sine curves always start at the midline. So let me draw in my midline, which helps me determine my amplitude, which is 1. My frequency is how many cycles am I going to have from 0 to 2 pi? Right now I have 1 cycle at pi, so that means I'm going to have 2 cycles at 2 pi. We're starting at x equals 0, so I don't need to worry about any shifts left or right. But since my midline is at 2, I need a plus 2 at the end of my function to move everything up. And then based off of my answer choices, we are left with choice 3, an amplitude of 1 and a frequency of 2. All right, and this on the bottom is homework 10-5. We never got a chance to go over this in class. So the answer key is posted for all of your notes up to 10-5 and all of your homework up to 10-5. So if you want to check this out, these ones, it told me what to graph, so both of them are going to be cosine curves. And they do look like cosine curves when we get a first glance. Remember that I always want to find my midline first. In order to determine the midline here, I want to try and figure out somewhere in the middle, which in this case is at 1. If you're not able to figure that out off the top of your head, to find the midline, I can use my maximum value, in this case is 4, plus my minimum value, in this case is -2, and divide that by 2. It's kind of like I'm taking the average from the max and the min. I want to figure out exactly what's in the middle. So 4 plus -2 would equal 2, divided by 2 is equal to 1. So I know that I have a midline at y equals 1. So that gives me my d value. D equals 1. From there, I could figure out A. So A is my amplitude, which always comes from my midline. So my amplitude in this case would be 3. We know we did it right if both amplitudes from the top, from the bottom equal each other. So A is equal to 3. And my last step now is to find my frequency. Frequency is how many cycles I have from 0 to 2 pi. So if I trace along here, that's 1 cosine function, 2 cosine functions in pi. So that means I'm going to have 3, 4 in 2 pi. Another way that you could do this and solve for the frequency is to determine the period of the function. So in this case, our period that it took to complete 1 full cosine cycle is pi over 2. So I know the period, pi over 2, is equal to 2 pi over the frequency. If I solve this for b, I'll also end up with 4. Once I have all of this information, I can write the equation of my function, which would be y equals 3 cosine of 4x plus 1. And this last one, same idea. This one's a little nicer because they actually drew the midline in for you, it looks like. So I want to determine how high up I'm going and how far down I'm going. You could count your boxes. It looks like it's going from 6 to 14, so that would be 8. And I could double check going down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I have my amplitude is equal to 8. And they gave me a midline of 6. My last step would be to determine the frequency. So how many cycles do I have from 0 to 2 pi? It would be about this much of the graph. Okay, which is hard to see. So this is when we can use this trick above that I was just talking about. And once we figure out the period, we could set that equal to 2 pi over the frequency. So I'm going to have the period here is at 6 pi. So I know that 6 pi is equal to 2 pi over b. If I cross multiply here, I'm going to have 6 pi b is equal to 2 pi. To get b by itself, let me divide both sides by 6 pi, and I'll get b is equal to 1/3. So if I needed to write an equation, I'll have y equals 8 cosine of 1/3 x plus 6. 8, 1/3, 6. All right, I'm sorry this is super messy on my iPad, but I hope this helps. If you go back in your notes, there was a matching practice on lesson 10-2, which is easier without all these shifts and not moving cosine and sine back and forth. But I think the biggest things to take away is when you look at a function, if I'm starting at a midline, then it's sine. If I'm not starting at a midline, then it's cosine. And remember, if my answer choices want the function to be cosine, I have to start at a maximum. If they want my function to be sine, I need to start at the midline. And for these other ones, I need to determine the midline first because I'm unable to write an equation without the amplitude, the frequency, and that's all going to be based off of the midline. All right, let me know if you guys have any more questions.